Misconceptions. For as long as there have been people studying history and trying to disseminate the information therein, there have been people who have either willfully or accidentally misinterpreted it. And so today on Desks and Dorks, we are talking about misconceptions in history that anger me. Hello, this is Kyle. I am the dork. A couple things. The YouTube pleasantries, if you feel like we deserve them, would go a great deal to supporting us. 2, we have a Kickstarter that's on right now. It's called A Fear Within. It's one of my favorite games that I have ever designed. It is a rules-light, horror-focused role-playing game that is Pokemon by way of Stephen King. It is really, really freaking neat, and backing it on Kickstarter right now or telling your friends about it is the single best way to support us. It is Pokemon by way of Stephen King. I know I said that once before, but it is, and I love it. This is like something that I genuinely adore, and I love this game so much. And again, your support would go a long way to helping us out and helping us to achieve the goal of getting this game done. As of right now, we are 48 hours in. We only have I think 500 of our original goal left. We're basically $1,000 funded in 2 days, which is great. Very, very excited about it, and I would love to have you on for the journey. 3, you all usually vote on my historical stuff, and so we are talking about misconceptions today because I will be at PAX Unplugged this weekend. What? If you're in Philadelphia, come say hi. I'll be there. But I am in PAX Unplugged this weekend. I was just in New York visiting my grandparents. I am allergic to something at their house, which is why I probably sound a little bit off. So a lot of things conspired to make it impossible for me to get our usual historical content out. We will be talking about cults, heretics, heresy, and clandestine religious groups next week. But for right now, let's talk all about misconceptions in history. And I am going to start off really freaking hot with this one, which is the idea that politics shouldn't be in history, or that you should keep politics out of history. This is wrong and is, frankly speaking, naive at best and how do I put this gently, insidious at worst. This was inspired actually by a comment that I had on our video on gold, where I mentioned the importance of Mansa Musa, not just as an African leader, but as somebody whose very presence had a vast and important economic impact on the regions that he ruled. And I'm just going to quote the commenter directly. They called Mansa Musa a small local lord of little importance. Look, that is how do I put this? You know what? I'm not even going to put it gently. By the way, I try really hard to be positive in these videos, but you all wanted me to talk about the things that anger me. I'm probably going to pop off a couple times during this recording. I understand there's a lot going on in the year of our Lord 2024, so if that's not your vibe, or if you're here usually for the good, happy Kyle vibes, then you know what? That's great. I would probably encourage you to leave, because I'm going to start talking about this right now. This is idiotic at freaking best. This is one of the stupidest things I have heard in my entire life. Look, even if you have crawled under a rock, to call Mansa Musa a local lord of little importance is an insane take. That's kind of like saying Jeff Bezos is a guy with a little bit of money. Look, even if your perspective, like mine, is centered on a certain time period or geopolitical location, it is impossible to miss the impact of Mansa Musa unless you are literally trying to. And I think that's truly what this commenter is doing, or they are a part of a school of thought and a school of scholarship that wants to downplay the achievements of African leaders like Mansa Musa, a guy who was, and I kid you not because he basically did it, literally rich enough to buy another country. See, here's the thing. This is part of a larger school of thought of British historians who outright either destroyed or downplayed records of African achievements in order to help justify their own imperialist aims. This is a huge issue, actually, when studying British scholarship and British historians from this time period, because of the imperialist movements within Britain. They had a vested economic and cultural and military interest in downplaying or destroying the achievements of their past leaders. Remember, it is far easier to convince a populace of humans to destroy another populace of humans when you dehumanize those people. If you can convince your citizenry that they are not fighting against their fellow man, but are fighting against savages, it is far more easy to justify the atrocities you're about to commit, which is why it pisses me off so freaking much when we talk about removing politics from history. Again, this isn't just, by the way, limited to white British imperialist historians of this time. The Romans and the Greeks changed and amended historical records constantly to illustrate key points or to make themselves look better. And in fact, they weren't even subtle about it. In fact, they were so not subtle about it that it was a widely recognized cultural practice. We know that Pericles and several different Athenian leaders actually did this, and they were kind of expected to the point that some of the contemporaries of those accounts were like, hey, yeah, this is embellished, but like also I expect it to be embellished, so take that for what you will. This is a mechanic, by the way, that comes up so often in historical records of Greece and Rome that it actually creeped its way into John Harper's Aegon, which is a role-playing game that I think is really neat, but involves a boast-counter-boast mechanic that is core to the experience of that game. Here's the thing, Saxon princes, by the way, also sometimes destroyed the legacy of their mothers in order to bolster their own achievements and failures. Now, thankfully, this has been slowly changed by a school of scholarship that is looking at the achievements of these Saxon women, many of whom held together important cultural and political unions that would have existed during the fall of the Roman Empire and long afterwards. In some cases, these women were great forces of unity, but again, when your son is called Athelfrid the Unworthy, it's kind of makes sense why you might want to downplay these achievements. Again, the reason I bring these examples up is that history is the study of the past, but there is a power and a strength in controlling the narrative. If we, as scholars or enthusiasts of history, attempt to divest history of its political leanings, we do so at our own risk. Because if we do not take ownership of a narrative, of a story, of the way that a culture presents itself, not just to its own citizens, but to the world at large, we risk giving control of that narrative to people who do understand its importance and have far more insidious intentions with it. It is, again, naive at best to assume that you can remove politics from history, and it is downright dangerous at worst. I get that I am a funny haha man on the internet. I understand those concepts. I literally make freaking role-playing games for a living. Why does anyone take me seriously or listen to what I say? My best-selling game in terms of units is a game called Becoming Banana Bread, where you become a sentient banana that wants to die. I'm not even joking about that. I was the level designer on Barbie Starlight Adventure, for crying out loud. But as a student of history, as somebody who genuinely cares about this, and who has secretly been Trojan horsing in a lot of educational value into these videos for you all, I have to tell you, this is one of the most dangerous trends in modern historical thought and scholarship. You cannot divest politics from history. Full stop, period. For as long as humans have been alive, they are going to engage in systems of power. It is essential. And if you're wondering why I'm so passionate about this, we're dealing with the effects of this right freaking now here in the United States. There has been, and always will be, unfortunately, a racially charged and in many cases racist ideology that has tried to rewrite the American Civil War. This is something I deal with pretty often because I was a junior park ranger in Gettysburg when I was a kid. I love the Civil War and I think it's incredibly fascinating, but the idea of the lost cause narrative or painting the idea that the Southerners were heroes really is done to our detriment. If you're really curious about listening to or learning about this, I will hopefully have some sources about Reconstruction in the comments below, but it's incredibly insidious and it's incredibly a problem here in the United States. By the way, as one more fun fact, I realize that I have already moved on to the next image of our presentation, but I want to point this out. One of the first films ever recorded, A Birth of a Nation, is literally a propaganda piece for the Ku Klux Klan. Seriously, if you don't think history is about politics, if you don't think politics is an essential and important part of historical study and thought, if you don't think there are individuals who have a vested interest in downplaying, destroying, or omitting details about history for their own gain or for the gain of people in power, then unfortunately, you are wrong. I cannot stress this enough. All right, I'm going to take like one deep breath. Cool, we got the serious stuff out of the way. That's great. Hopefully, again, you all asked for me to do this, so I came in hot there. I told you I would. I warned you. I did. I warned you all. But now that we've already had our one fun, very serious topic, let's talk about something else, which is aliens building the pyramids. I'm going to blame the History Channel for this one because this just happens way more than it should. I don't know what it is about human beings that we see the achievements of the past and we are like, there's no way we could have done that. Human beings were stupid. Don't worry, we'll get to that take in a little bit. But again, this misconception is one that I don't think is as widespread, thank God, as it could be, because holy smokes, the fact that some people think this is real baffles my mind. But again, it's one that I want to address because it is so frustrating, and it does kind of make me take another big, deep pause. But I'm going to go over in rapid fire form the arguments that some of the aliens built the pyramids people have, and I'm going to prove why they're stupid, because let's be real here, the pyramids are one of the towering achievements, of human history and of the human race. They're incredible and they're amazing, and I just hit my own microphone, so whatever, I'm not editing this. Ha, love you all. So, 1, the pyramids can't be that old. Yes, they can. How are they that old? We can carbon date them. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what carbon dating is, and I realize that maybe some of my audience is unfamiliar with carbon dating, carbon is an element that exists within a lot of stone formations or things that have been fossilized. We know, based on chemistry, what the half-life of carbon is, which means we know the rate that carbon decays. We know the half-life, by the way, this is another chemistry concept that I'm going to explain for the purpose of my audience, is the idea of when it hits its half-life, the carbon is 50% of the way from totally decaying and dissipating. Since we know what that is, we can essentially use carbon as a, shall we say, benchmark or a flag post, basically, how do I put this? A framework for us to understand the age of things. So, no, the pyramids are that old. In fact, several of the pyramids would have still been constructed while there were woolly mammoths still alive, which I think is absolutely bonkers to think about. If we know their age, we can carbon date them. That is a very easily dispelled misconception. 2, they didn't have enough skilled workers. Oh boy, are you wrong there. We know how many workers they had. By the way, not all of them were slaves. In fact, a fair number of them were not. They were actually highly paid, highly skilled craftsmen who actually would have trained their children, and then they would have trained their children's children, and this process would have continued on forever. Until the pyramids were done. We know this because we have tablets like this one. This one, by the way, is taken from Iraq. This one is not taken from Egypt, but we have tablets like this one that would have actually told us how much workers were paid, and workers would have been paid in food, in beer, and in land. The other thing that we have that proves the sheer number of workers that actually labored on the pyramids are these things. This is basically an Egyptian timesheet. I am not even joking. There was a scribe assigned to areas on the pyramid. Their job was to record the work activities for that day. They would have either a long papyrus reed, or they would be on a platform, and they would essentially write down what every worker, foreman, and manager would do. This is actually incredible to look at, and this, by the way, is not the only Egyptian timesheet we have. We have many of these, by the way. This is really important for us to talk about. Though some of them are not in this condition, but we do have fragments of many of them, or scraps of, or even larger ones like this one. So we know this record keeping was something that they did, and it was incredibly detailed, and they needed to keep those detailed records because if you didn't meet your work quotas for the day, you got paid less, kind of like working an overtime job, which is absolutely bonkerbillies to think about. But yeah, not only do we know how many workers we have, in some cases, we know exactly what every worker did every day they were on the job site, which is freaking wild. We also know how the workers were fed. By the way, this area that is depicted in the picture in front of you isn't a barracks, it isn't a sleeping quarters. This is just where they kept the cows for one section of the workers. So you might be thinking to yourself, logistically, Kyle, that's insane, right? If you had that many workers, how would you feed them, house them, clothe them, and keep them fed? Well, I know I said fed twice, but they would do it by essentially doing what Amazon or like Google or like major corporations or the US military does. And instead of making sure that, everything is scattered, you just bring all of the essentials for a literal army to the place the literal army is going to be at. So the picture here is depicting one cattle pen, not the only one of several cattle pens that would have been used to feed the workers on the pyramids. Again, it's really crazy to think about this, but I need you to realize that at the time the pyramids began their construction, Egypt was a basically untouched, uncounterable, and unblemished empire that had access to the greatest minds in human history at the time, the limitless resources of Africa, which is a big-ass continent, in case you've never looked at a map before, with a ton of natural resources, and the entire population of Africa, as well as basically any other empire, nation-state, city-state, whatever, that was within traveling distance, and Pharaoh could pay to work on his lovely vanity project. Imagine the resources and might of the entire country being funneled into one project. cough, cough, you don't have to imagine that. We did that with the Apollo program here in the States to a much less degree. Imagine if we multiplied the time, resources, commitment, and fervor of the Apollo project by like 3,000%, and you have an idea of what it was like to work on the pyramids. Another one that comes up often: they couldn't transport or work with the stones. Wrong-o again, friend. Allow me to introduce you to one of mankind's greatest, wonderful inventions. This is the wheel. I know that some of you, I can't blame all of you, because there was like a Rose art book that just showed dudes hauling stone, but wheels were a big thing. Interestingly enough, though, I love this image, by the way. Interestingly enough, though, some of you have probably seen images of people hauling stones, and that was true, except there's two things working in their favor, which are physics. If you look up in the top left corner, each ramp grows with the pyramid, which means that basically as the workers finished up a layer, the ramp would go along with them. So it means that they were not constantly having to shift things around. But what I think is even more interesting is that these ropes and wooden pulley setups essentially act as fulcrums. They act as a pulley system, allowing every man's strength to be multiplied, which makes hauling those stones up much easier and much more efficient than it would be if they were just hauling it. It's something that we kind of overlook, but the use of basic physics and basic torsion as a means of propulsion is a real thing. This was something I learned as well, by the way. Is that they sometimes created downward ramps so that you could sort of slide the major stone blocks around, which I thought was pretty interesting. This was something I did learn that was brand new for this one. This is hieroglyphics depicting what is essentially a giant water slide as a means of transportation. The workers would create a sled or a sledge like this one. They would secure whatever large stone piece they were hauling, and then what they would do is they would take large buckets and tubs of water and they would wet the sand, kind of like pouring soap onto a tarp if you're like me and you grew up making like redneck water slides in the summer. But if you put like soap on a tarp and you slide down it's really fast. It's like a homemade water slide. It's kind of the same principle where the water would have been mixed with some substances. They would have put stuff kind of a little bit under the sand, and essentially they basically water slided the stone blocks around. I realize I'm kind of dumbing down a very core concept of like physical science here, but I just think it's awesome to think that the Egyptians legitimately just water slided part of the pyramids together. I think that's incredible. One last thing that people constantly bring up with the aliens comment, which is just infuriating, is like, you can't drill holes of that magnitude into the stone. They did. This is a drill, by the way, and this is actually something that you can recreate at home, but this is essentially a stone drill. What happens is a pole like this, and we know that the poles had certain regulation sizes to make sure that when they slid in the rods that would help keep the pyramids relatively straight during construction. But all of the poles had their own relative sizes. And what happens is you would take a long version of this drill, you would put one person on either side. Then what you would do is you would take a chisel, like that chisel right there, you would chisel out a small hole where you wanted the larger, more uniform hole to be drilled. And what you would do is you would pour sand into that hole, and then you and another worker would push and pull that wooden lever back and forth. The rope would then cause the stick to twirl really quick, and the friction from the force of the push and pull, the hardness of the wooden rod, and the friction caused by it rubbing up against the grains of sand would over time drill a hole into the limestone that is both uniform and straight, which I think is really interesting and really neat. So again, they can transport the stone. We know how many workers they have. We know how old the pyramids are. We know exactly how they drilled through it. All of those things are there. This is the most infuriating one. But why are the pyramids everywhere? Surely this means... No, it doesn't mean anything. It literally just means basic physics. Look, I don't know if any of you build sandcastles, but do you ever build a sandcastle with the narrow part at the bottom and then the big part at the top? If you're like me and you're a kid and you're like, man, this like weird Martian looking tower would look super sick if I build it right here on this beach. And then it falls on you, right? Because that's literally just basic physics. If you put stuff at the bottom of a structure and then you go up slowly, your structure generally tends to be more stable. It is literally just caveman logic of more rock at bottom, good. Less rock at top, also good. It literally just boils down to physics. And again, this leads me to my third misconception that I really hate all the time, which is that ancient people were dumb. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, all of the stuff that you and I often take for granted, and the people who think aliens built the pyramids take for granted pretty often, is that ancient people had an incredible amount of understanding of the world and studied very much so. The stuff that you and I take for granted, physics, chemistry, philosophy, art, literature, those things, engineering especially, mathematics especially, were all started by our predecessors in the ancient world. Now, while these individuals did not have a perfect understanding of these sciences, it's important for us to take into account that they would have gotten a lot of those things slowly but surely and used that knowledge to help with projects like the pyramids. This happens quite often in conversations with people who have never studied medieval or even ancient history or the classical period, but human beings are driven to learn. Humans are by their very nature incredibly curious, inquisitive, and you know what, I'm going to say it, intelligent individuals and creatures. I think human beings are awesome, and I actually have a lot of faith in the human race, in our ability to learn, to adapt, and to innovate. And this is something that is borne out over time by our ancestors. It's an important part of the human process of discovery. And I'm going to use one example here. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes is a Ptolemaic mathematician, philosopher, and scholar. Eratosthenes is famous for proving that the Earth is round thousands and thousands of years before anybody else did it, and he did so using an experiment that you can recreate at home. Essentially what happened is that Eratosthenes would travel often across the world, and as he did, he would go, essentially in this case, from Alexandria to Syene, and he would realize that, oh, the shadows of the obelisks are different, and if the world is flat and a light source is shining down upon them, then that means I can't be living on a flat world. Surely something is different. You can recreate this experiment by yourselves. If you are interested, I will show you how to recreate it in a separate video, but essentially if you stick two pencils into a sheet of paper, you can mark where the shadows of those pencils are under a light, and then what you can do is you can bend the paper, the shadows will warp. This is essentially a very simple recreation of the phenomenon that Eratosthenes observed. Then, what I think is really interesting and why I chose this particular illustration from the Encyclopedia Britannica for our use today is you can see that Eratosthenes used geometry, of which he was a founding member of geometric thought and discovery, but he used that and the angles of the isosceles triangles to accurately predict within a 3% margin of error the circumference of the planet. And he did this like 1,000 years before Galileo was even born. I just think that's incredible, and it's great proof that human beings are capable of incredible stuff if we give them the credit to. Remember, your ancestors aren't dumb, they just lack the foundation of knowledge that you have, and that sometimes we take for granted. This is also one of the ways that I actually get to talk a little bit about some of the discoveries in the Muslim world, while my backing is Eurocentric. I did take a couple courses on Muslim civilization and Islamic history, and I find those periods to be incredibly fascinating. I find their literature to be rich, and their history to be incredibly colorful. But one of the things that I think we take for granted is that the first pharmacies were not established here in the United States or anywhere else for that matter. The first pharmacies were established by the Abbasid Caliphate, I believe I'm getting that correct, in the Muslim world, hundreds of years before we would ever have one of those things. The Muslims realized, hey, it makes tons of sense to have specialized doctors and patients who need to go see you for specific things. So they made categorizations. Wings in hospitals, by the way, is another one of their advancements in medicine, which I think is really neat. And finally, Misconception 4, which is liking one period or part of history makes you hate the others. This is not something that I see often, but it is something that I got thinking about. There is another content creator who pointed out when she's like, oh, I love medieval history, and then a guy says, I love medieval history. She's like, I know all about you. And she's like, yeah, you're probably into the military side of things. And my first thought was, hey, and then my second thought was, yeah, she's kind of right, actually. But it's something that I've gotten better at, and I think I would encourage everybody to get a little bit better at too, because I genuinely believe that learning about areas outside of your interests is essential, because it makes you a better person, and it makes you a better historian, right? I study arts and literature, I study culture, not just because I like art and I like literature and I like culture, but because by doing so, I gain an understanding of what people find fundamentally beautiful and fundamentally valuable. I study something like gender sciences or gender politics because I'm a dude, and I don't often think outside of my own dudeliness, and sometimes that can be really difficult, particularly when there are so many powerful women or even gender non-conforming individuals within world history, and gaining a perspective on how they think can help me when I'm breaking down primary texts, or when I'm breaking down correspondence between them and some of their other allies, or even some of their enemies. Understanding physics, understanding the work of people like Aristophanes, or not Aristotle, Archimedes, for example, can give me additional insight into how these men viewed the world and how they would have been viewed by other men. It's really interesting and fascinating, especially for me, whose primary purpose is, as a creative writer, to think about physics, because, as a great author once said, any amount of science or math that is fundamentally misunderstood appears like magic to the untrained eye. And I think that's really true for characters like Archimedes, who the Romans lived in eternal fear of, because the dude just kept making math-powered super weapons to stop them from conquering Sicily. Seriously, look it up. It's really cool, or I'll just do a video on it later. But what I'm saying with all of this is, being a historian means loving every subject, and the reason you have to love every subject as a historian is because human beings encompass all things. We are not one-dimensional. We are multifaceted characters and creatures. We are capable of immense horror and immense terror and incredible atrocities, but we are also capable of some of the most beautiful, meaningful, and amazing things that you'll ever get to hear about, ever. And I think that's like the coolest part about studying history and coming to an understanding, not just of myself, but of my fellow man, because it's so cool. Like, human beings are everything, and whether or not there is life outside of our planet, I think there is, or whether or not we'll actually live to see it, who knows. But I do know that this is the planet that we've got. This is the species to which I belong. And if I'm going to do my due diligence and do my due scholarship, I need to have as multifaceted a view and a background as possible, because the individuals that I study, whether they live in 2024 or in 24 BC, are as well-rounded, as well-faceted, and as multidimensional as I am. And I think if I'm going to study them with the degree of reverence and respect they deserve, then I need to be multifaceted too, so that I can better appreciate all of the things that they encompass. And with that, I think that's all the misconceptions that bug me for today. This is a relatively short one. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, back the Kickstarter if you can. Would mean a lot to me if you like it. Do all the YouTube pleasantries. And yeah, if you're going to study history, please, read a book by somebody outside of your expertise or your discipline. Get to know another multifaceted domain, and try to get to know your fellow man, meet them where they're at, because I think that's the most essential thing you can do if you want to be a true scholar of history, and if you want to engage with historical scholarship in good faith. I think that's, like, if you're going to take away that, any core lesson from this, I think it's that. Oh yeah, and aliens didn't build a pyramid. Screw that shit. That sounds awful. Wow, that was 2 curse words, man. I did great today. I thought I was gonna do way worse for this. But in any case, yo, I appreciate it. Thank you all so much. Also, really quick, we recently broke 7K subs. We are swiftly on our way to 8K, which is nuts. If everything holds, if the numbers hold, we will be at 10K by the end of December, which is bonkers to me. That's really crazy. That's really crazy to think about. But I really appreciate it. So thank you all for everything. That's it. I'm Kyle for Desks and Dorks. You guys are great. I'll see you in the next one.